Racist cop detains black man, then discovers he's his new commissioner. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The morning air was brisk as Officer Brad Harper adjusted his duty belt and prepared for another day on patrol. Brad prided himself on being a no-nonsense cop who kept the streets clean, but beneath his confidence lay a set of biases he wasn't even aware of, or at least never acknowledged. As Brad cruised through the city in his patrol car, he scanned the sidewalks for anything that seemed out of place. His partner, Officer Daniels, sat silently beside him, occasionally glancing at his phone. "It's too quiet today," Brad muttered, tapping the steering wheel impatiently. Daniels smirked. "Quiet's not so bad. Means people are behaving. Or it means they're just getting smarter about hiding it," Brad replied, his tone tinged with cynicism. His eyes flicked to a man walking down the street. A tall black man in a tailored gray suit, carrying a briefcase. The man exuded confidence, his stride purposeful as he headed toward the subway station. "Who's this guy trying to impress?" Brad muttered, narrowing his eyes. "He looks like he's up to something." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "What, walking in a suit is suspicious now?" "Just a hunch," Brad said, pulling the patrol car to the curb. "Let's check it out." Daniels hesitated but said nothing as Brad stepped out of the car and approached the man, who was now waiting at a crosswalk. "Hey, you!" Brad called out, his tone sharp. The man turned, his expression calm but curious. "Yes, officer? Can I help you? Mind telling me where you're headed?" Brad asked, his eyes scanning the man's briefcase as if it might hold something incriminating. The man raised an eyebrow. "I'm heading to a meeting. Is there a problem?" "Let's see some ID," Brad demanded, ignoring the man's question. The man frowned but maintained his composure. "Am I being detained?" Brad crossed his arms. "Not yet, but I've got the right to ask questions, don't I?" The man sighed, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a driver's license. "Here you go," he said, handing it over. Brad glanced at the ID, his eyes narrowing. "Marcus Ward. What kind of business do you have around here, Mr. Ward?" "I don't believe I'm obligated to answer that," Marcus replied, his tone steady but firm. Brad's jaw tightened. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he already considered suspicious. "You're acting pretty defensive for someone who's got nothing to hide," he said. "I'm not defensive," Marcus replied. "I'm assertive. There's a difference." The tension between them was palpable. Brad's hand hovered near his radio, while Marcus stood his ground, his calm demeanor unshaken. A small crowd began to gather, their curious whispers filling the air. "All right, that's enough," Brad said, reaching for Marcus's arm. "You're coming with me." Marcus stepped back, his voice rising slightly. "I haven't done anything wrong. You're detaining me without cause. Resisting now, are we?" Brad said, grabbing Marcus's arm and pulling him toward the patrol car. "Officer, this is unnecessary," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll cooperate, but I won't be manhandled." Daniels, who had been watching the scene unfold, finally spoke up. "Brad, maybe we should stay out of it?" "Daniels," Brad snapped, opening the car door and guiding Marcus inside. At the precinct, Brad walked Marcus through the front doors, his grip firm on the man's arm. Officers at their desks looked up, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Marcus, though visibly irritated, maintained his composure. "What's the charge?" one officer asked as Brad led Marcus toward an empty interrogation room. "Suspicious behavior," Brad said curtly. The officer frowned but said nothing, returning to his paperwork. Daniels, trailing behind them, looked uneasy but kept quiet. Once inside the room, Brad gestured for Marcus to sit. "All right, let's start with what you were really doing out there." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression one of quiet defiance. "I told you. I was heading to a meeting." "With who?" Brad pressed. "That's none of your concern," Marcus replied. Brad slammed his hands on the table, his patience wearing thin. "Listen, pal, the more you cooperate, the easier this'll be for you." Before Marcus could respond, the door opened and the precinct captain, a stern woman named Captain Hayes, stepped inside. Her sharp eyes darted between Brad and Marcus, her expression unreadable. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Brad straightened, his tone defensive. "Caught this guy acting suspicious downtown. Figured we should check him out." Captain Hayes crossed her arms. "Suspicious how?" "He was walking around, looking like he didn't belong," Brad said, immediately regretting his choice of words. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Didn't belong? Officer Harper, do you have any actual evidence of wrongdoing?" Brad hesitated. "Not yet, but..." "Enough," Hayes said, cutting him off. She turned to Marcus, her demeanor shifting to one of respect. "Mr. Ward, I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding." Brad's stomach dropped. "You know him?" Hayes fixed him with a glare. "Yes, I do. Marcus Ward is our new police commissioner." The room fell silent. Brad felt the blood drain from his face as he stared at Marcus, who now wore a faint, knowing smile. "Commissioner," Brad echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's correct," Marcus said, his tone calm but pointed. "And I'd like to know why one of my officers felt it necessary to detain me without cause." Brad stood frozen, his mind racing. How had he missed this? How could he have been so blind? He glanced at Captain Hayes, who was clearly furious, and then back at Marcus, whose composure only deepened his shame. I didn't know," Brad stammered. "I was just following procedure." "Procedure?" Marcus repeated, his tone sharp. "Profiling someone based on their appearance isn't procedure. It's bias." Captain Hayes stepped forward, her voice cold. "Officer Harper, I want you to wait outside. Now." Brad nodded stiffly and left the room, his heart pounding. As he stood in the hallway, the reality of his actions began to sink in. He had profiled a man, his new boss no less, based on nothing more than his own prejudices. Brad paced the hallway outside the interrogation room, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and regret. How had he let his biases get the better of him? And worse, how was he going to face Marcus Ward now, knowing the man he had wrongfully detained was not only innocent but also his new boss? Inside the room, Captain Hayes spoke with Marcus in hushed tones, her expression a mixture of apology and concern. The door opened moments later, and she stepped out, her sharp eyes locking onto Brad. "My office, now," she ordered. Brad followed her down the hall, his stomach in knots. When they reached her office, she closed the door behind them and gestured for him to sit. She remained standing, her arms crossed. "What were you thinking?" she demanded, her voice cold. Brad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I thought he looked suspicious," he said weakly. "Suspicious? For what? Wearing a suit? Carrying a briefcase?" Hayes's tone was scathing. "Do you even realize how damaging this could have been if it weren't Commissioner Ward? What if it were a civilian? This department cannot afford these kinds of mistakes, Harper. We're supposed to protect and serve, not humiliate and profile." Brad felt a lump rise in his throat but didn't dare speak. He knew there was no excuse for his behavior. "Effective immediately, you're on probation," Hayes continued. "You'll undergo mandatory bias training, and you'll report directly to Commissioner Ward. Maybe working with him will teach you the empathy you clearly lack." Brad's heart sank. Reporting to the man he had just humiliated? It felt like a punishment designed to crush what little pride he had left. Later that afternoon, Brad sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. The precinct buzzed with activity around him, but he felt like he was in a fog. Daniels approached, sitting on the edge of Brad's desk. "Rough day, huh?" Daniels said, his tone cautious. Brad glared at him. "You think?" Daniels shrugged. "Look, man, I tried to tell you to back off, but you didn't listen. Now you're stuck fixing this mess." Brad sighed, leaning back in his chair. "What am I supposed to do? How do I fix this?" "You start by owning up to it," Daniels said. "The guy's our commissioner now. You don't have a choice." Brad knew Daniels was right, but the thought of facing Marcus again filled him with dread. The following morning, Brad arrived at the precinct early, hoping to avoid any awkward encounters. He was organizing paperwork at his desk when Marcus walked in, his presence commanding but not overbearing. The room fell silent as officers exchanged uneasy glances. Marcus approached Brad's desk, his expression unreadable. "Officer Harper," he said, his tone even. "A moment of your time." Brad stood, his heart pounding. "Yes, sir." Marcus gestured for Brad to follow him into one of the conference rooms. Once inside, he closed the door and turned to face Brad, his arms crossed. "Let's start with the obvious," Marcus said. "Do you understand why what you did was wrong?" Brad nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir. I made assumptions about you based on things I shouldn't have. I was wrong." Marcus studied him for a moment before speaking. "Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, has no place in law enforcement. Do you know why?" Brad hesitated. "Because it undermines trust?" "Exactly," Marcus said. "Trust is the foundation of our relationship with the community. When officers act on bias, it erodes that trust and makes it harder for us to do our jobs." Brad nodded, feeling the weight of Marcus's words. "I understand, sir. And I'm sorry." Marcus's expression softened slightly. "Apologies are a start, but actions speak louder. Captain Hayes has assigned you to work with me on a community outreach program. I expect you to approach this with an open mind and a willingness to learn." Brad felt a mix of relief and apprehension. "Yes, sir. I'll do my best." "I hope so," Marcus said, his tone firm. "Because this isn't just about you. It's about the entire department and the message we send to the people we serve." Over the next few weeks, Brad found himself thrust into unfamiliar territory. The community outreach program involved working with local residents, attending meetings, and participating in events designed to rebuild trust between the police and the neighborhoods they served. At first, Brad felt like an outsider. Many of the residents were hesitant to engage with him, their distrust of law enforcement evident. But as the days went on, he began to see things from their perspective. He heard stories of people who had been unfairly targeted, just as Marcus had, and it opened his eyes to the impact of his actions. One afternoon, Brad and Marcus attended a town hall meeting where residents were invited to share their concerns about policing. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. A woman stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. "My son was stopped by an officer last month for no reason other than walking home from school. He's 13 years old. What kind of message does that send to him?" Brad felt a pang of guilt, knowing he had been guilty of similar behavior. He glanced at Marcus, who addressed the woman with empathy. "I'm sorry your son experienced that," Marcus said. "Incidents like that are unacceptable, and we're working to ensure they don't happen again. But we can't do it alone. We need your voices to guide us and hold us accountable." The woman nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you for saying that." As the weeks turned into months, Brad began to earn the trust of the community and his colleagues. He took the bias training seriously, reflecting on his own prejudices and making a conscious effort to change. He also learned more about Marcus's background, how he had risen through the ranks despite facing discrimination, and how he had dedicated his career to improving policing. One evening, after a particularly successful community event, Brad approached Marcus. "Commissioner," he said, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to thank you for giving me a chance to learn from this. I didn't deserve it, but you gave it to me anyway." Marcus looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "Everyone makes mistakes, Officer Harper. What matters is what you do to make it right." Brad nodded, his respect for Marcus growing. "I won't let you down." "I hope not," Marcus said with a small smile, "because there's still a lot of work to do." Brad's transformation didn't happen overnight, but as the weeks turned into months, the changes in him were undeniable. He began to view his role as a police officer through a different lens, one that prioritized service over suspicion, empathy over authority. Working closely with Marcus, Brad found himself inspired by the commissioner's vision for the department and his relentless dedication to bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. One of the pivotal moments for Brad came during a community policing workshop held at a local recreation center. The workshop, organized by Marcus, brought together officers and residents to engage in open dialogue and collaborative activities. The goal was to foster understanding and break down the barriers of mistrust. The room was filled with a diverse mix of people: families, business owners, community leaders, and officers from the precinct. Brad sat at a table with a young man named Jamal, who had been vocal about his distrust of the police. Jamal's younger brother had been arrested the previous year for a minor offense, and the experience had left a deep scar on his family. "Why should I trust you?" Jamal asked bluntly, his arms crossed. "You don't care about people like me. You just see us as criminals." Brad hesitated, the weight of Jamal's words hitting him hard. "You're right," he said finally. "We haven't done enough to earn your trust. But I'm here because I want to change that. I can't undo the mistakes of the past, but I can work to make things better moving forward." Jamal studied Brad for a moment, his expression skeptical but slightly softened. "I'll believe it when I see it." "That's fair," Brad said. "All I ask is for the chance to prove it." The workshop ended with a group activity where participants worked together to come up with ideas for improving community relations. Brad and Jamal's group suggested organizing regular neighborhood events where officers could interact with residents outside of enforcement situations. The idea was well received, and Marcus promised to make it a priority. As the attendees began to leave, Jamal approached Brad. "I'm still not sure about you," he said, his tone cautious. "But you listened today, and that's a start." Brad nodded. "I'll keep listening, and I'll keep showing up." Back at the precinct, Brad continued to work closely with Marcus, helping to implement the changes they had discussed during the workshop. One of the first initiatives was a mentorship program that paired officers with local youth, giving them the opportunity to build positive relationships. Brad was paired with a teenage boy named Malik, who lived in a neighborhood often labeled as high crime. At first, Malik was wary of Brad, keeping their conversations short and guarded. But over time, as they spent more time together, a bond began to form. One afternoon, Brad took Malik to a local basketball court, where they played a game of one-on-one. As they rested on the sidelines afterward, Malik opened up about his experiences with the police. "Most of the time, they don't even talk to us," Malik said, spinning the basketball in his hands. "They just assume we're up to no good." Brad nodded, his chest tightening with guilt. "I used to be one of those officers," he admitted. "But I'm trying to do better now, and I want to make sure other officers do better too." Malik looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "You're different from what I expected." "I wasn't always," Brad said. "But people like you and Commissioner Ward are helping me see things differently, and I'm grateful for that." As Brad continued to work with Malik, he found himself learning just as much as he was teaching. Malik's perspective gave him a deeper understanding of the challenges faced by young people in underserved communities, and it motivated him to push for even more changes within the department. Marcus noticed Brad's progress and began to entrust him with more responsibilities. He assigned Brad to lead a task force focused on improving community engagement, a role that required him to work closely with both officers and residents. "You've come a long way," Marcus said one day as they reviewed the task force's plans. "But remember, this work is never done. Building trust takes time, and it requires consistency." "I understand," Brad said, "and I'm committed to seeing this through." Marcus nodded, his expression one of approval. "Good, because this department needs more officers like you." One of the most impactful events organized by the task force was a community day held at a local park. The event featured food, music, games, and activities designed to bring people together. Officers participated alongside residents, breaking down barriers and building connections. Brad spent the day manning a booth where kids could try on police gear and learn about the role of law enforcement. Malik stopped by with a group of friends, their laughter and energy infectious. "You look like you're having fun," Malik teased as he watched Brad help a young girl try on a police hat. "I am," Brad admitted, grinning. "This is what it's all about." Malik nodded, his smile widening. "You're all right, Officer Harper." "Thanks, Malik," Brad said, his chest swelling with pride. "That means a lot." As the sun began to set, Marcus took the stage to address the crowd. His voice carried through the park, filled with both authority and warmth. Today is a reminder of what we can accomplish when we come together, he said. We still have a long way to go, but events like this show that change is possible. Let's continue to build a community where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the evening air. Brad stood among them, his heart full as he watched Marcus speak. He knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time he felt hopeful about the future. As the months went on, Brad's dedication to the task force and the community outreach program became evident not only to Marcus but to the entire precinct. The officers who had once viewed Brad as a strict and by-the-book cop began to notice the changes in him. He was more approachable, more empathetic, and more willing to listen. For the first time, Brad wasn't just enforcing the law, he was building bridges. One morning, Captain Hayes called Brad into her office. She gestured for him to sit and leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "Officer Harper," she began, her tone neutral but tinged with curiosity, "you've made quite a turnaround over the past few months. Marcus has spoken highly of your work, and I can see the results myself. But I want to know, what's driving this change?" Brad hesitated, gathering his thoughts. "Honestly, Captain, it was the wake-up call I needed. I realized that the way I'd been doing things wasn't just wrong, it was harmful. Meeting Commissioner Ward and seeing the impact of my actions firsthand made me rethink everything." Hayes nodded, her expression softening. "It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong and to work to make it right. Keep it up, Harper. This department needs more officers willing to learn and grow." "Thank you, Captain," Brad said, his voice steady. "I won't let you down." As Brad's confidence in his new approach grew, so did his rapport with Marcus. The two began working closely on initiatives to address systemic issues within the department, from improving recruitment practices to implementing regular bias training. Brad's unique perspective as someone who had experienced a personal transformation proved invaluable. One afternoon, Marcus invited Brad to join him for a meeting with city officials to discuss funding for community programs. As they entered the conference room, Brad felt a pang of nerves. He had never been involved in discussions at this level before. Marcus noticed his hesitation and gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You've earned your place here, Harper. Speak from the heart, and they'll listen." The meeting began, with city council members debating the budget and prioritizing various initiatives. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he presented a compelling case for the importance of community engagement in improving public safety. "This isn't just about reducing crime," Marcus said, his voice steady. "It's about creating an environment where everyone feels valued and respected. Programs like these don't just benefit the community. They make our officers better at their jobs." One of the council members turned to Brad. "Officer Harper, as someone directly involved in these programs, what's your perspective?" Brad took a deep breath, his mind racing. "Before I started working on these initiatives, I thought I knew what it meant to serve and protect," he said. "But I've learned that it's not just about enforcing laws. It's about building trust. When we invest in these programs, we're investing in relationships, and that's what makes the real difference." The room fell silent for a moment before the council members began nodding in agreement. The discussion ended with a unanimous vote to increase funding for the programs, and Marcus gave Brad an approving nod as they left the room. "Nice work, Harper," Marcus said. "You're becoming quite the advocate." Brad smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "I'm just following your example, sir." As the community programs expanded, so did their impact. Brad and Marcus often attended events together, their partnership becoming a symbol of the change taking place within the department. Residents who had once viewed the police with suspicion began to see them as allies, and officers who had been resistant to change started to come around. One evening, Brad and Marcus attended a dinner hosted by a local advocacy group. The event brought together community leaders, activists, and law enforcement to celebrate the progress they had made and discuss the work that still lay ahead. During the dinner, Brad found himself seated next to an older woman named Mrs. Jenkins, who had been a vocal critic of the police for years. She was known for her sharp tongue and unyielding stance on accountability. "So, Officer Harper," Mrs. Jenkins said, her tone skeptical, "I hear you've had a change of heart. What brought that on?" Brad chuckled nervously. Let's just say I had a lot to learn, and Commissioner Ward made sure I did. Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. And do you really believe things can change? Or is this just a phase? Brad met her gaze, his expression serious. I know things can change because I've seen it happen. But I also know it takes time, and it takes people willing to do the hard work. That's why I'm here. Mrs. Jenkins studied him for a moment before nodding. Well, I'll be watching. Don't let me down. As the evening went on, Marcus took the stage to give a speech. He spoke about the importance of accountability, the progress they had made, and the challenges that still lay ahead. Change doesn't happen overnight, Marcus said. It takes commitment, patience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But together, we can create a system that truly serves everyone. The audience erupted into applause, their support palpable. Brad joined in, feeling a sense of pride and belonging he hadn't experienced before. The following week, Marcus called Brad into his office. As Brad sat down, Marcus handed him a folder. "What's this?" Brad asked, opening it to reveal a letter of recommendation. "It's for a leadership program," Marcus said. "I think you're ready for the next step in your career." Brad stared at the letter, his mind racing. "You really think I'm ready for this?" Marcus nodded. "You've shown me that you're not only capable but also committed to making a difference. This program will help you take your work to the next level." Brad felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Marcus said with a smile. "Now go make me proud." As Brad walked out of Marcus's office, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The man who had once acted out of ignorance and bias was now working to dismantle those very systems. It hadn't been an easy journey, but it had been worth it. And as he looked ahead to the challenges and opportunities to come, Brad knew one thing for certain. He was just getting started. Brad's admission into the leadership program marked a new chapter in his career. The program, hosted by a renowned police academy, brought together officers from across the country who had shown a commitment to progressive change in law enforcement. For Brad, it was both an honor and a daunting challenge. He knew the expectations were high, and he was determined not to disappoint Marcus or himself. The first day of the program began with an icebreaker session, where participants were asked to share their reasons for joining. As Brad listened to his peers, he was struck by the diversity of experiences and perspectives in the room. Some spoke of personal encounters with injustice, while others highlighted their desire to improve relationships between police and the communities they served. When it was Brad's turn to speak, he stood up, his nerves making his voice tremble slightly. "I'm here because I've made mistakes," he said candidly. "I used to think being a good cop was about enforcing the law and keeping the streets safe. But I've learned that it's about so much more than that. It's about trust, empathy, and accountability. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." His honesty was met with nods and murmurs of approval, and Brad felt a sense of relief. For the first time, he realized he wasn't alone in his journey. There were others who shared his vision for a better, more inclusive approach to policing. The program's curriculum was rigorous, covering topics such as conflict resolution, implicit bias, community engagement, and leadership strategies. Brad found himself challenged in ways he hadn't anticipated, but he embraced every opportunity to learn and grow. One of the most impactful sessions was a workshop on restorative justice, where participants role-played scenarios to understand the perspectives of both victims and offenders. In one exercise, Brad was assigned the role of a teenager who had been unfairly accused of shoplifting. As he navigated the scenario, he felt a deep sense of frustration and helplessness, emotions he realized were likely experienced by many of the people he had encountered in his career. After the exercise, the facilitator asked the group to reflect on their experiences. Brad spoke up, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "This was eye-opening for me. I've been the one making those accusations, and I never really thought about how it felt on the other side. I see now how important it is to approach every situation with fairness and understanding." The facilitator nodded, her expression one of encouragement. "Acknowledging our biases and mistakes is the first step toward change. And change starts with individuals like you." Back at the precinct, Brad's participation in the program didn't go unnoticed. His colleagues, many of whom had initially been skeptical of his transformation, began to respect his dedication and openness. Even Captain Hayes, who had been one of Brad's toughest critics, acknowledged his progress during a staff meeting. "Officer Harper has shown us what it means to grow and adapt," she said. His work with the community and his commitment to improving this department are examples we should all strive to follow. Brad felt a mix of pride and humility as his colleagues applauded. He knew he still had a long way to go, but moments like this reminded him that his efforts were making a difference. One of the most rewarding aspects of Brad's journey was his ongoing partnership with Marcus. The two men had developed a mutual respect and camaraderie that went beyond their professional roles. Marcus often invited Brad to join him at community events, where they worked together to rebuild trust and foster understanding. At one such event, a town hall meeting focused on youth engagement, Brad had the opportunity to speak alongside Marcus. The room was filled with parents, educators, and teenagers, all eager to hear about the department's initiatives. Brad stood at the podium, his heart pounding as he addressed the audience. "When I first became a police officer, I thought my job was just about enforcing the law, but I've learned that it's so much more than that. It's about listening, building relationships, and making sure everyone feels safe and respected." He shared his experiences working with Malik and other young people, emphasizing the importance of giving youth a voice in shaping their communities. "Our future depends on the next generation," he said, "and it's our responsibility to support them, guide them, and show them that they matter." The audience responded with applause, and Brad felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced before. For the first time, he wasn't just a cop. He was a bridge builder, a mentor, and an advocate for change. As Brad continued to grow in his role, he encountered challenges that tested his resolve. Not everyone in the department shared his vision, and there were times when he faced resistance from colleagues who were reluctant to embrace change. But Brad remained steadfast, drawing strength from his experiences and his partnership with Marcus. One particularly difficult moment came when Brad overheard a group of officers making disparaging remarks about the community programs. The comments stung, but instead of walking away, Brad decided to confront them. "Look," he said, his tone firm but measured, "I get that change is hard, and it's easier to stick with what we know. But the world is changing, and we have to change with it. These programs aren't just about making the community feel better. They're about making us better at our jobs." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them muttered, "Yeah, well, not all of us have the commissioner in our corner." Brad's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "This isn't about me or Marcus. It's about all of us. We have a chance to be part of something bigger, to make a real difference. But it starts with being willing to listen and learn." The group fell silent, and while Brad wasn't sure if he had gotten through to them, he knew he had done the right thing by speaking up. Brad's commitment to change slowly began to ripple through the department. Over time, officers who had initially been resistant started showing a willingness to participate in community programs and attend workshops. Marcus had always said that leadership wasn't about forcing people to change but inspiring them to want to, and Brad was beginning to see the truth in those words. One day, Marcus called Brad into his office. The commissioner had a thoughtful expression as he gestured for Brad to take a seat. "Harper," Marcus began, leaning back in his chair, "I've been keeping an eye on your work, and I'm impressed with the progress you've made. Not just with the community, but within the department as well." "Thank you, sir," Brad said, his voice steady but humble. "I've just been trying to follow your lead." Marcus chuckled softly. "It's more than that. You've become a leader in your own right. And that's why I want you to take point on a new initiative." Brad's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "A new initiative?" Marcus nodded, sliding a folder across the desk. "We're launching a program to bring officers and community members together in a mentorship capacity. The idea is to pair officers with residents who can offer insights into the challenges their neighborhoods face. It's a way to build trust and understanding on both sides." Brad flipped through the folder, skimming the program details. It was an ambitious plan, but he could see its potential. "This is a great idea," he said, meeting Marcus's gaze. I'd be honored to lead it. I thought you might say that, Marcus said with a smile. I trust you to make it a success. The program, named Bridging the Gap, launched with a pilot in one of the city's most underserved neighborhoods. Brad worked tirelessly to recruit officers and residents to participate, spending countless hours attending meetings, knocking on doors, and spreading the word. His sincerity and determination won over even the most skeptical residents, and soon the program was off the ground. One of the first pairs in the mentorship program was Brad himself and a woman named Mrs. Rivera. A lifelong resident of the neighborhood, Mrs. Rivera was a retired teacher who had seen the community through its highs and lows. She was known for her no-nonsense attitude and her fierce love for her neighbors. Their first meeting was at a local community center, where Mrs. Rivera greeted Brad with a critical eye. "So, you're the officer who's supposed to learn from me," she said, her tone half-joking. Brad smiled, unruffled. "That's the idea. I'm here to listen and learn." Mrs. Rivera nodded approvingly. "Good, because this neighborhood has a lot to teach you." Over the next few weeks, Brad and Mrs. Rivera met regularly, walking through the neighborhood as she pointed out areas of concern and shared stories about the people who lived there. She introduced Brad to local business owners, parents, and even teenagers who hung out on the corner. With each interaction, Brad gained a deeper understanding of the community and its struggles. One afternoon, as they walked past an abandoned lot littered with trash, Mrs. Rivera sighed. "This used to be a playground," she said. "The kids loved it, but it fell into disrepair, and no one cared enough to fix it." Brad frowned, the sight of the neglected space stirring something in him. "Why hasn't the city done anything about it?" Mrs. Rivera gave him a pointed look. "Because they don't think this neighborhood matters. That's what we've been fighting against for years." Brad's jaw tightened. "Maybe we can do something about it." Mrs. Rivera raised an eyebrow. "We?" Brad nodded, his mind already racing with ideas. "If we organize a cleanup and get some volunteers, maybe we can turn this back into a place the kids can use. I'll talk to Marcus and see if we can get some support from the department." Mrs. Rivera's expression softened, and for the first time, Brad saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. That would mean a lot to this community. The cleanup effort became a rallying point for the neighborhood. With Brad and Mrs. Rivera leading the charge, residents and officers came together to clear debris, paint benches, and install new equipment. The transformation of the lot into a vibrant playground was a testament to what could be accomplished when people worked together. On the day of the grand reopening, the playground was filled with laughter and excitement as children ran and played on the new equipment. Parents watched with smiles, and even the most skeptical residents couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Marcus attended the event, standing alongside Brad and Mrs. Rivera as they watched the children enjoy the fruits of their labor. "You've done something incredible here," Marcus said, clapping Brad on the shoulder. "It wasn't just me," Brad replied. "It was all of us." Mrs. Rivera nodded, her eyes shining. "This is what happens when people care." "Thank you, Officer Harper, for listening, for learning, and for being part of this." The success of Bridging the Gap caught the attention of other neighborhoods, and soon, the program expanded citywide. Brad found himself busier than ever, juggling his responsibilities with the program, his leadership training, and his regular duties as an officer. But despite the long hours, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, after a particularly long day, Brad sat in his car outside the precinct, reflecting on how far he had come. The man who had once viewed the world through a narrow lens of suspicion and authority had been transformed by the very people he had once failed to see. And while he knew there was still work to be done, he felt hopeful about the future. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Proud of you, Harper. Keep it up." Brad smiled, his resolve strengthened. He texted back, "Thanks for believing in me, sir. Let's keep making a difference." Months turned into a year, and the impact of the Bridging the Gap program was undeniable. Crime rates in the participating neighborhoods had dropped significantly, and trust in law enforcement was steadily rising. Residents who had once viewed officers with suspicion now saw them as allies, and officers like Brad had grown deeply connected to the communities they served. One day, Brad received a call from Mrs. Rivera. Her voice was warm but carried a sense of urgency. "Officer Harper, there's a young man I think you need to meet. His name is Darius, and he's been having a rough time lately. He's a good kid, but he's on the edge of making some bad decisions." "Thanks for letting me know," Brad said. "I'll talk to him." Brad found Darius hanging out at a corner store with a group of friends. The teenager's guarded expression softened slightly when Brad approached. "Darius?" Brad asked. "Yeah," the boy replied, his tone cautious. "I'm Officer Harper," Brad said. "Mrs. Rivera told me about you. Mind if we talk for a minute?" Darius shrugged but didn't object, so Brad led him to a nearby bench. They sat in silence for a moment before Brad spoke. "Mrs. Rivera says you're a good kid," Brad began. "But she's worried about you. What's going on?" Darius hesitated, then let out a frustrated sigh. "It's just, I'm tired, man. My mom's working 2 jobs and we're still barely making it. School doesn't feel like it matters. And the streets are the only place where I feel like I belong." Brad nodded, his chest tightening. He had heard stories like Darius's before, but each one hit him just as hard. "I get it," he said. "Life's throwing a lot at you, and it feels like no one's got your back. But you've got people who care about you, like Mrs. Rivera. And you've got potential, Darius. Don't let the streets take that from you." Darius looked at Brad, his expression conflicted. "Why do you care? You're just a cop." Brad smiled faintly. "Because I've seen what happens when good kids like you don't get the support they need. I've seen how hard it is to come back from bad choices. And because people cared enough to give me a second chance when I messed up." Darius frowned. "You messed up?" "Plenty of times," Brad admitted. "But I had people like Commissioner Ward who believed I could do better. And now, I'm here to do the same for you." Darius didn't respond, but the wheels were clearly turning in his mind. After a long pause, he said, "All right, Officer Harper. I'll think about what you said." "That's all I ask," Brad said, standing up. "And if you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." Over the next few weeks, Brad made it a point to check in on Darius, slowly building a relationship of trust. He introduced the teenager to mentorship programs and helped him find part-time work at a local community center. Darius's attitude began to shift, and for the first time in a long while, he started to envision a future for himself beyond the streets. One day, Darius approached Brad with a hesitant smile. "Hey, Officer Harper, I've been thinking about going back to school. Maybe even college someday." Brad's heart swelled with pride. "That's a great idea, Darius. You've got what it takes to make it happen." "Thanks," Darius said. "For everything. You're the one doing the work," Brad replied. "I'm just here to cheer you on." As stories like Darius's became more common, the success of Bridging the Gap garnered national attention. News outlets covered the program, highlighting its positive impact on the community and the department. Brad was often interviewed, sharing his journey from a skeptical officer to a champion of change. One interview in particular stood out. The reporter asked, "Officer Harper, what inspired you to change the way you approach policing?" Brad thought for a moment before answering. "It was meeting Commissioner Ward. He showed me that being a good cop isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about building trust, listening, and being willing to learn. And it was the people in the community who helped me see that we're all in this together. Change starts with understanding, and understanding starts with listening." The success of the program also strengthened Brad's bond with Marcus. The 2 men, who had started as adversaries, had become partners and friends. Marcus often joked that Brad was his star pupil, but Brad knew that Marcus's mentorship had been the key to his transformation. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Marcus invited Brad to his home for dinner. Over a meal prepared by Marcus's wife, they talked about their journey and the road ahead. "You've come a long way, Harper," Marcus said, raising his glass. "But don't get too comfortable. There's still plenty of work to do." Brad laughed. "Don't worry, sir. I'm not planning on slowing down." Marcus smiled. "Good, because I'm counting on you to keep this momentum going. This isn't just about us. It's about the legacy we leave behind." As the program continued to grow, Brad found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He thought about the day he had wrongfully detained Marcus, the biases he had carried, and the lessons he had learned. It hadn't been an easy road, but it had been worth it. One day, while walking through the precinct, Brad stopped to look at a bulletin board covered in photos and letters from community members. Among them was a photo of the playground he had helped restore, filled with smiling children. Beside it was a handwritten note from Mrs. Rivera that read, "Thank you for caring." Brad smiled, his heart full. He knew there was still work to be done, but he also knew that every step forward mattered. The story of Officer Brad Harper and Commissioner Marcus Ward wasn't just about redemption and growth. It was a testament to the power of accountability, empathy, and the belief that change is possible. Together, they had not only transformed a department, but also inspired a movement that would continue to shape the future of policing for years to come.